I just need to ask, there's some people on the call I can't recognize because their name is not associated. Is Representative Harrison on the call? Pricey, are you on the call? I'm not sure if you've joined. Okay, if everyone could just give me 1 minute to try to contact Representative Harrison. I know she's trying to join. She said she'd be here at 4:30, so just let me try to contact her. Give me a second, please.
Hey.
Okay, great. I think everyone is here. So let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I want to also thank our special speakers and guests, whom I will introduce in a minute. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Ed Turiakian. I'm the executive director of the Dying Right North Carolina, which is an advocacy group trying to enact medical aid in dying legislation in North Carolina. I'd like to also introduce my fellow board members who are on the call. Mary Spear, who is a registered nurse and an ethicist. Dr. Franz van Hagen, who is not a medical doctor, but a PhD sociologist in sustainable living and sustainable dying. William Hazard, who is a gerontologist who started the gerontology department at Wake Forest Baptist University. And Jane Niver, who is a resident, who is an established and well-known journalist in the area and who has handled all our public relations efforts at Dying Right. And Joan Keston, who is a internationally traveled lawyer and elder lawyer who just recently retired from the bar and lives in Wilmington. I'm very grateful for all the work they have done and they do. Before we begin with our first guests, I would like to share with you a map. If you will just 1 second. It is this map here, and it tells a story, which I'd like to make clear to everybody. The states in red are the ones that have enacted or have authorized medical aid in dying legislation. And please notice a couple of things. One is that the first state to pass it was not until 1997. That was Oregon by a referendum. And then the next state was 12 years later, Washington. That's a big hiatus, 12 years. And then things began to pick up. 2013, Vermont, 2016, California, Colorado, the District of Columbia in 2017, and then Hawaii, New Jersey, and Maine in quick succession. There's now 10 jurisdictions where medical aid in dying is available. And there's also 5 or 6 countries that are that have authorized it, including our neighbors to the north and south, Canada, Mexico, Colombia, Belgium, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and there's legislation pending in Ireland, in Spain, and maybe even in Italy. The point I want to make is that there's a movement here. There's a movement and a momentum. And we want to establish North Carolina as one of the next states to join that momentum. We believe it's feasible, especially with the help of the people that are on the call today, you all, and our guest speakers. And I'm very gratified that they've joined our effort. So the first person I'd like to introduce today is a person who has been really the guardian angel of medical aid in dying legislation in North Carolina, Pricey Harrison, who's from Greensboro, and she represents the district in Greensboro. She went to Duke University, and then to balance the rivalries within state, she went to UNC Law School. She was in private practice for many years as a communications lawyer before entering the legislature in 2004. So this is now her, 9th term coming up. She won unanimously her vote in November. Not a single vote against her. She was unopposed. That tells you how fearsome a political contender she is. But I am very grateful for her because Pricey introduced legislation for the first time in 2015 and 2017 and 2019. And we are very, very grateful for her stalwart efforts. She really has been our champion. So Pricey, please take it away and tell us what you think about things.
Thanks, Ed, and you're too kind. I'm just really channeling you and your energy. But so I would have had a different conversation if the election results had turned out differently in November, because for some reason this issue has taken on a little bit of a partisan tint in our state, which is unfortunate because we all know this is not a partisan issue. But I got involved in this because I lost my husband to lung cancer, and then a few years later, back in 2011, I lost my sister to a brain tumor. And it just so happened that was a couple of months before the Dying Right in Oregon documentary screened in Durham at the Full Frame Film Festival. And I was had been batting around in my mind that this was an issue I wanted to work on. Nobody really worked on it in the legislature before. But that I started thinking about it more seriously. And I think in 2015-16 session, it took me a couple of biennium to get my act together, but I joined with a couple of my colleagues to basically follow the Oregon law and introduce that in North Carolina. And my hope was that issues that aren't easy take years to make it through the legislative process. And so I just was hoping to get a conversation going and perhaps a study. But there hadn't been a ton of traction. And then Ed and his and a group of folks working on aging issues got together with me and a couple of the other sponsors, and we talked about how to build momentum for this. That's when we had the big, I guess we had a Chapel Hill forum, and then a couple of years later there was a Charlotte forum, building sort of a grassroots effort. And I'm grateful to Dying Right in North Carolina for building that momentum, because that's what you need to get legislation like this passed. You need pressure on legislators from their constituents. And I'm certainly hearing from constituents all over the state for whom this is a big issue. I think what Ed has done for me is helped fine tune the legislation. So I think it's a model bill, and it has a lot of provisions in there that aren't in other state statutes that accommodate concerns that having been expressed by whether it's the disabilities community or hospice or others who have concerns about this legislation. But I mean, I'm not ready to give up. I filed it 3 or 4 times now. I'm planning on filing it in January. And I want to continue to work on this. We ran into a roadblock last biennium when we thought that What generally happens with controversial bills is you file them, and if you get the support of leadership, you turn it into a study, and then the study points out issues that make sense and maybe recommends legislation to the full legislature, because you don't really have time in a 50-minute committee meeting. So we thought that we'd get a study, and we thought we had the support for a study, but we got some major pushback from some of the conservative groups. And that's where I think it's turned into more of a partisan issue, because it sort of prevailed upon the Republican leadership to not turn the bill into a study. So we will have to overcome that obstacle, because an issue like this will likely not get enacted without some sort of thorough committee review. And right now we can't even get that. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm encouraged by all the red states there that were on the map. Red meaning adopted the legislation, not the other red. And you see none of them are in the Southeast. So often what happens at the legislature is you sort of like, what are our neighbors doing? Well, our neighbors aren't really doing anything, although I do recall that Virginia has had a study. So I'm not going to sound like them. I am encouraged. I'm encouraged by this enthusiasm. I'm encouraged by this group that has evolved into a pretty massive grassroots campaign, and all the enthusiasm for folks having the right to choose. And I believe I heard Diane Rehm say that, calling it the right to choose, and that's my perspective on this. It's the right for folks to choose how they deal with these issues. So I'm going to keep fighting, and I'm going to work with you all, and I appreciate your support, and I'm sticking around for any questions.
Thank you so much, Pricey. I think she's underspoke how helpful she has been. She really has been our champion. And I would request that everybody hold off on your questions until all of our speakers have finished. We have 4 speakers, and I'd like you to hold off your questions till then, and then we can all you'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So the next speaker is a woman who I can just tell you, I spent years and years between 10 and 12 o'clock on most weekdays listening to her. Diane Rehm is an iconic figure in America. She started as a volunteer on WAMU in Washington, D.C. in 1973. And then I think by 1979, she had her own show. And by 1984, that show, which had been called Kaleidoscope, was rebranded The Diane Rehm Show, which we've all come to know and love. She retired from The Diane Rehm Show in 2016, but has a very a lovely podcast. She's a published author. She's published several books. The first one was Finding My Way, a bestseller. The one I love the most is On My Own, which was sort of a story about the death of her husband of 54 years or so. And she has recently finished another book called When My Time Comes, which is a series of interviews, both pro and con, on the medical aid and dying question, which will be turned into, or has been turned into, a documentary which will be broadcast on PBS in April. And her book, On My Own, will be out in paperback, I think this month sometime. So without further ado, please, Diane, take it over, please. I think you're still on mute, Diane. If you could unmute yourself, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
The book that comes out in January in paperback is When My Time Comes. It was originally published in a hardback last January. So the book is based on the documentary that we spent 3 years filming around the country, speaking with doctors, patients, nurses, priests, clergy, on both the pro and con side of medical aid in dying. We wanted to present as full a portrait as we could. And Pricey, the first thing I want to say is to you, in Maryland, where I testified in favor of medical aid in dying, and in Massachusetts, where I also testified. In Maryland, the bill has come up 4 times, and the last time it lost by just 1 vote. So I hope you will keep on keeping on, because we just don't give up on these things. I'll tell you just a little bit about my husband. He was a brilliant lawyer. He worked in both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations on trade issues. Finally went into private practice in 1969, and in 2000 he finally retired from the law. 4 years later was diagnosed with Parkinson's. Finally, when we realized he needed to have full-time care, he went into a nursing home where he stayed for about a year and a half. At the end of that time, he could no longer feed himself. He could no longer stand on his own. He could no longer bathe himself, toilet himself, or take care of himself in any way. And he said to me, "Diane, I'm ready to die. I really want this to be over." Now, his doctor within the nursing home had already said he was within 6 months of dying, which is a requirement of virtually every law that has been passed in the country, that you must have 2 doctors certify that a patient is within 6 months of death. John had been so certified and said to his doctor, "I am ready to die and I want you to help me." Unfortunately, the nursing home was in Maryland, which still does not have a right to die law. The doctor said, "I cannot ethically, morally, or legally help you in any way. The only thing you can do is to stop eating, drinking, and taking medication." So we had a conference call with my daughter, who is also a physician, our son, who is a vice president of a university, and the doctor. My husband told my children that that's what he wanted to do. And my daughter, the doctor, said, "But Dad, we can keep you comfortable." And John said, "Damn it, I don't want comfort. I have lost my dignity. I know if I continue to live, I will lose even more of that dignity. I am ready to die." So I left the nursing home that day. I came back the next day with a photograph album I had made for John years before of his childhood. He was born in Paris, came to this country at the age of 7, knowing no English, became this brilliant student and brilliant lawyer. And we sat on his bed looking at these photographs, and I said to him, "Sweetheart, you look wonderful." I mean, he was pink, he was smiling, and he said, "Diane, I have not had any water. I've not had any food. I've not had any medication. I have begun the journey. And I said to him, "Are you sure this is what you want?" And he said, "I am absolutely certain." It took John 10 long days to die, and I was there with him. And on that last night, I was sleeping on 2 chairs, or trying to sleep, with my little dog on my stomach. I got up, went, and the caregiver whom we had hired came in the next morning. And I said, "I'm going to take the dog home to feed him. I'll be back quickly." And as soon as I walked in the door, the caregiver called and said, "Diane, please come back quickly. He's going." And I got there 20 minutes too late. Had Maryland had medical aid in dying, I could have been there with my husband, who did not have to suffer through 10 days of starvation and thirst. V said, as it is known, stopping eating and drinking is used by many people who do not have access to medical aid in dying. But through the map that Ed has shown you, 1 in 5 people in this country now has access to medical aid in dying. 1 in 5. And I will do everything I can to help you in North Carolina, the people of Maryland, the people of Massachusetts, where my daughter lives, people all over the country, to have medical aid in dying. I believe that if you say that God should be the only decider, I will support you 100%. If you say, I want everything that medical science can provide, I will support you 100%. And I would ask you to support me as I choose for myself medical aid in dying. Who knows who will use it? Only 2/3 of those in the country, in those 9 states plus the District of Columbia, only 2/3 of those who have received the medication have used it. The other third have simply taken comfort in knowing that they have that option. And the option is what we are asking for. The conversations like these are what we need. Not just one conversation with family, doctors, friends, but many conversations. And I hope eventually that North Carolina's conversations will persuade those delegates that the people of North Carolina deserve to have choice at the end of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. And I know that with the support from someone like yourself, we're a lot closer in North Carolina. before I introduce our next guest, I want to make 2 points on what Diane said. One is that on the map I showed you, it unfortunately begins to look more and more like a partisan issue. The states where it has passed, with one exception, Montana, the states where it has passed are essentially blue states. And this is unfortunate because it gives the appearance of being a partisan issue. And we all know death and dying is not partisan. Republicans die as much of cancer as Democrats do. And it's very important that we get a state that looks redder, and North Carolina still looks red, or maybe purple, but red for the time being, that we get a southern state, a Bible Belt state, to also pass the legislation. The second point I want to make is a very important one that Diane pointed out, which is that a full third of people that go through the trouble, and it's an elaborate process to get this prescription, a full third that go through that process are comforted enough that they can allow nature to take its course, knowing that that medication is by their bedside. That alone gives them the strength, the sense of autonomy, the sense of control that perhaps the cancer has robbed them of, to continue. In the legislation which Representative Harrison proposed 2 years ago, the drug was not called an aid in dying drug as it is in other states. It was called a terminal comfort care drug, because maybe only 2/3 take the medicine, but 100% get comfort from having it by their side. And we think that's indispensable. Our next guest, not mine, our next guest, Barbara Mancini, is a woman whose ordeal moved me so much, horrified me so much, that I got involved in this movement. Barbara Mancini was a loving daughter and nurse in Pennsylvania. When she was called to her, when she was called to take care of her father, she handed him a vial of medicine at his request. And as a result of that, she was prosecuted for over a year for the simple fact of having helped her father take the pain medicine that he'd requested. She chronicled all this in a book called Cruel Death, Heartless Aftermath. It was profiled on 60 Minutes. It was a horrifying interview for my sake, because I felt immediately that no person should go through what she went through, and no person should go through what her father went through. So I'll ask Barbara, please, to tell your story, because it really brings to life how important getting this type of legislation passed is.
Thanks, Ed. I'm happy to be here to talk to everybody today, and I want to wish everyone a warm hello. I've been to North Carolina several times to discuss my story, and you can read about it in full in the book. It has a lot of surprising twists and turns, so I recommend it. I'm not the only person who's been prosecuted on a charge of aiding an attempted suicide. And I do go into similar prosecutions from other jurisdictions in the book. I did extensive research and a deep dive into how such unfortunate situations can lead to criminal charges. I think it's really important for people to be aware of how badly things can go at the end of life. And in my book, I describe the entire flawed process, from my father's substandard end-of-life care to the specious prosecution against me, a family caregiver who was trying to advocate for my dying and suffering elderly father. So just very briefly, what happened in 2013, I was arrested in Pennsylvania and charged with aiding the attempted suicide of my dying 93-year-old father after handing him his legally prescribed morphine. He was enrolled in home hospice care, but his pain was not being properly managed, and he took much more than the recommended dose. When I told a hospice nurse what he'd done, she called 911. And I want to note here that my father was breathing normally. He had not lost consciousness. He was able to follow commands and he was able to respond to questions. Yet, the police ordered paramedics to take him to the hospital for life-prolonging treatment, which was in complete defiance of his written advance directive and his stated wishes. He was then subjected to 5 days of unwanted medical treatment. And sadly, that even included having his hands restrained. And the anguish he experienced over my arrest just compounded my father's misery. He ultimately died of pneumonia and sepsis. I endured a year-long prosecution, which caused me to lose my job and incur legal fees of over $100,000 before a judge ultimately dismissed the case against me. The judge rightly determined that there was no merit to the prosecution's case. Pennsylvania criminal law enabled this prosecution to go forward. This law is vaguely worded, and it merely says that a person who intentionally aids another to commit suicide is guilty of a felony. The law does not say what specific actions rise to the level of aiding a suicide. So the prosecutor in my case interpreted the law to mean that I had committed a felony by handing my father his pain medicine. Despite the fact that my father, who had normal mental capacity, was permitted by physician order to self-administer his own medications. This prosecutor presumed to know what my father's intent was at that time. And so they pressed forward with this case, and it ultimately ended with an embarrassing loss for them in court. So I'm very thankful that I won my court case. But this whole thing, it really exacted a huge toll on my father, me, and my entire family, mentally, emotionally, and financially, a huge toll. And I do live with the fallout from this to this day. I tell my story, and I wrote this book to raise awareness about the pitfalls that people can face at the end of life. And I hope to prevent others from enduring the kind of trauma that was inflicted on us. North Carolina is one of the few states that has no specific criminal law regarding aiding a suicide. And so that might lead you to believe that an unwarranted prosecution like mine will not occur in North Carolina. However, you should be aware that until very recently, Utah was another state like North Carolina that had no such criminal statute against aiding a suicide. That changed in 2018 when the Utah state legislature very quickly, in under 3 months, successfully passed a law that made aiding suicide a felony manslaughter offense. And, I was thinking earlier about what Pricey had said, how this is a partisan issue. And I don't know if this law that was passed in Utah was in response to aid in dying statutes being proposed in Utah, but they were proposed before they made aiding a suicide a felony, and it had not been that before. So this same thing could happen in North Carolina too. I guess in many ways it has become a partisan issue. The aiding suicide statutes, like in Pennsylvania and Utah and many other states, are so vaguely worded that they allow for broad interpretation by police and prosecutors. And that's a big problem. In most states, the laws that criminalize aiding a suicide make no distinction between the desire of the dying to have a comfortable and peaceful end on their own terms versus a mental health crisis that would tragically lead someone to end their lives prematurely. The only jurisdictions that codify this distinction are the ones that have enacted aid in dying. Even the American Association of Suicidology, an organization whose mission is to understand and prevent suicide, makes a big distinction between aid in dying and suicide. They view aid in dying not as an act of self-destruction, but rather as a carefully considered option filled with safeguards against abuse that allow the terminally ill to preserve their sense of self and dignity, something that was so important to Diane's husband. So it's clear, my case clearly raised some issues about what family members face when caring for a loved one at the end of life. It is a scary prospect to know that decisions you make can be judged critically through the lens of a prosecutor. So here's why I advocate for aid in dying. It preserves patient autonomy by allowing people to have control over their own dying process. There are clear majorities in every state that believe terminally ill people should have the right to determine what their own end-of-life care should be, including the option of aid in dying. Data from California and Oregon show that aid in dying has improved overall end-of-life care. And of course, from my perspective, aid in dying legislation prevents the inappropriate application of criminal statutes by making aid in dying for the terminally ill clearly distinct and different from the mental health crises that lead to suicide. So I just want to say I applaud everyone's efforts for trying to get this legislation off the ground in North Carolina. Ed, thank you for inviting me to participate in this. And I, like Diane, want to do everything I can to help move this forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I heartily recommend to everybody her book, and also looking at the 60 Minutes interview that she did a few years ago with Anderson Cooper. It's a horror story. It's a horrifying experience that she went through, especially for her 93-year-old veteran, World War II veteran father. I'd like to make 3 points before passing on to my next guest. One is that there is all sorts of protocols in the medical aid and dying legislation to make sure that the applicant is not suffering from something as simple as a depression. The person actually will have to undertake a mental health review if that's the cause. Typically, it's not the cause. The person is perfectly rational. They understand that they are at the end of life due to a terminal disease, such as a cancer or ALS, and they've accepted the reality of it in full consciousness and full awareness. The second thing is Barbara was prosecuted under the delusion of the sheriff and the prosecutor that she was aiding a suicide. Well, two things. It was never clear that actually her father had a suicidal intent. That's absolutely not clear. It was never proven. But the second thing that you should all know is that had her father decided that he did want to end his life then and there, that is perfectly legal in every state in the country. Suicide is not a crime. Suicide was a crime. It is not a crime anymore. So to prosecute someone for helping someone do something that's perfectly legal is also a bit outrageous. But again, as Barbara pointed out, we believe that at the end of life, when somebody decides to accelerate an inevitable end, that is not the same thing as suicide. Finally, Barbara did make an observation that North Carolina is one of the few states that has not criminalized aid in dying. To assisting a suicide. This is from a law review article that came out in October of 2020 by a renowned scholar on medical aid and dying across the country, Thaddeus Pope. Now, you may not be able to read this, but he has concluded in this law review article that North Carolina is the 11th state in the country that allows aid and dying, based on a law review article that makes the very point that Barbara made, that there is actually no prohibition in the statutes against medical aid and dying, and if there's no prohibition, it must be legal. I think our next speaker will address that very point, But I just want to point out that we don't believe that if medical aid in dying is technically legal, that makes it accessible. It is not accessible in North Carolina. There are no doctors writing prescriptions in North Carolina. There are no patients who can have access to medical aid in dying in North Carolina. We believe that we need Pricey Harrison and her colleagues in the State House and in the State Senate to pass legislation to make this a reality. But I wanted to point out that the very point that Barbara is making has caused some people to comment on that. Our next and final guest is Dr. Deric Weiss. He practices in Wilmington. He's board certified in internal medicine, hospice, and palliative medicine. He's been a hospice medical director since 2004. Most interestingly for our conversation, he practiced both in Washington and in Montana before relocating to Wilmington. And in both of those states, medical aid in dying is authorized and legal. And Dr. Weiss has had some personal experience with patients who have requested medical aid in dying. And so he can tell us how it actually works and what is the protocols that he goes through as a doctor before he would write such a prescription. So Deric, if you could take it away, please.
Thanks, Ed. And thanks very much for allowing me to join this group. I'm awed by the company here this evening. As Ed mentioned, I've worked in hospice for many years, and I think I first became aware of the need for medical aid in dying because of my hospice work. Hospice does fantastic work with patients at the end of life. We do a really good job of especially physical symptom control, providing support for families. But, it became readily apparent there's a lot that hospice just is unable to help with. And those things were mentioned earlier, like the sense of loss of control that somebody who's dealing with a serious or terminal illness may be going through, and also the feelings of burden. I hear that a lot from patients that, you just don't want to be a burden on your family as you're dying, at least for long periods of time. And hospice just, it's hard. Those are hard things for the hospice, the way they work in our country, to really address. And when I was working in Montana when it became so-called legal there, and I say that because we don't have a law like Oregon and Washington had at the time. It was more a product of a case that was taken to the Montana Supreme Court on behalf of a patient who wanted to use medical aid in dying and didn't feel like they could. And I went to the Supreme Court hearing, and it was really interesting. Heard the pros, the arguments for and against it, and that sort of thing. But basically, the Supreme Court decided that the Montana Constitution is very respectful of individual rights, and that there is no legal way that a prescriber, so a doctor, could be prosecuted for murder by providing a prescription to somebody to end their lives who is already terminally ill. And so that was easy in the fact that it made it legal, but I think from a practical point of view and in actually seeing how this works, it's made it challenging in some ways. Even though it's now been legal since 2007, just in the last year, I had a hard time finding pharmacies that would be willing to dispense these medicines. It took a lot of just legwork to try to convince somebody that it was okay. I had one pharmacist contact the state pharmacy board, and the state pharmacy board told them, no, don't do this. This is illegal. You could lose your pharmacy license by participating in this. So there's a lot of misunderstanding around it. And I think some of that's because we don't have a well-defined law like Oregon and Washington. I think physicians also feel more comfortable with it if we have those guidelines that are built into the laws, like in Oregon. In my practice in Montana, if I was to prescribe this, I would follow the same guidelines and checklists that are provided in the law in Oregon and Washington, just to make sure that I covered everything appropriately, because there were no guidelines at all. And on the legal side of that, that's great. That should make it readily available and accessible to everybody. But when it comes to the practicalities of it, it really hasn't. I wanted to just talk a little bit too about how I came to where I am with accepting this and being supportive of this law. And I think at the time that it was being debated in Montana, I was chairman of our hospital ethics committee, and so we spent a lot of time just talking about this. And there was a lot of wisdom in the room, going back and forth, and some older physicians that said they would have never considered this in their entire life. They thought it was wrong. But after we talked about it and weighed the pros and cons, everybody kind of decided that, yeah, hey, this is the right thing to do. And I think what it came down to me was that what is my job as a doctor? Is it only that I'm there to treat disease and prolong life? And no, it's not. I think we have other important aspects that we have to include, such as advocating for our patients and helping them to achieve their goals for their own health and their own lives, and helping however we can for that. And when I started looking at it that way, I really couldn't see any ethical reason why this shouldn't be acceptable. One of the things Ed asked me to comment on too is the Hippocratic Oath that we all take when we graduate from medical school, and doesn't this violate that? And that was pretty easy for me to get around, just because, for one, the original Hippocratic Oath isn't used anymore. And there's a number of reasons for that. The original Hippocratic Oath said things like, you wouldn't be paid for your services. And if any of you have ever been to the doctor recently, I'm sure you didn't get that service for free. So just things like that, it just doesn't apply to our modern times. And the modern Hippocratic Oath doesn't really exclude it either. And there's a lot of different ones. Different medical schools use different ones. But how I could sum up the Hippocratic Oath now, it's basically, it says, do no harm. And I would argue that if I have a patient with a terminal illness who I know is going to die in 6 months, and they're suffering terribly, and they want to have this available, then I am doing that person harm by not providing that. And so I think that's one way I would see the whole Hippocratic Oath issue. I think some of the things I saw in Montana after this was legalized and people became more aware of it was some of the, like Barbara mentioned, she said this has been shown in numerous states that we have improved our end-of-life care as a result of these laws. And I would absolutely agree with that. I think just the fact that it's more known, that patients feel free to bring that up. It's not a taboo subject. And that is really important. I mean, I get pretty excited if somebody asks me about this, just because that's my foot in the door to really ask questions and really dig deep into, okay, what are we talking about here? What are your concerns about what you're going through? Where are your goals for the end of your life? And really try to tailor our care to meet those needs and goals. And a lot of the time, the whole aid in dying aspect kind of goes away after that, because we just needed to talk about it. We needed that icebreaker, to get to those important conversations. And then ultimately, if somebody wants to go down that road and get that prescription, we know each other very well by that point. And then we get both to the stage where I'm ready to write that prescription. And as Barbara also mentioned, a lot of people don't even use it. So even the people that get the prescription don't use it, but even the people that just bring it up, the majority don't ever even go that. They just want to know that that's an option, that they have that safety net that we can use if it's necessary. I think I'll stop with that, Ed, but I'm happy to expand on anything else.
Thank you, Deric. Thank you very much. That's very, very helpful to understand how it works. So we'll open it up to questions now. There's two ways you can ask a question. If you can sort of make a gesture with your hand, I'll see you and I'll and give you the mic. And then you unmute yourself, please. If you're not asking a question, please stay on mute. The first question will be with MJ. The other way to ask a question, by the way, is there's a chat box down at the bottom. If you can enter a question through the chat box. MJ, just before I pass it to you, I just want to point out one thing on top of what Deric said about hospice. He's a hospice physician. Folks, the statistics show that 95% of the people who use medical aid in dying in the states where it exists, 95% are enrolled in hospice when they apply for medical aid in dying. So they do go into hospice, and for some reason, whatever, they decide hospice is not the right thing for them, or they want to accelerate the process. So medical aid in dying is not in any way incompatible with hospice. MJ, you have a question?
I do. I'd like to make a statement first. My passion for doing this is very different from most of what I hear. Both of my parents had a good death, a wonderful, peaceful death. My father in my arms, my mother in the bed beside us with my 3 daughters and my son. I want to say that all hospices are not created equal. Our hospice nurse that night sent my husband to the pharmacy to get more morphine. My mother died in pulmonary edema. That's a very, very difficult way to die. But through the night, which took her 7 hours, she was comfortable. My question for Dr. Weiss, having your experience in Montana and coming to North Carolina now, and with this position of Thaddeus Pope and Catherine Tucker, in fact, who are both lawyers very involved in end-of-life issues, having his statement on North Carolina that this will follow a standard of care and there is no law preventing it. Are you comfortable to write positions in North Carolina?
Not right now. I think that needs to be a little more better fleshed out. In Montana, we had a Supreme Court case that we could use. I think there might be a physician out there that's willing to test this, but after hearing our earlier speaker and some of the horror stories about the legal process, I don't know that I would want to be the test physician to go through that when that came. I think there would just need to be, in North Carolina, I think it needs to be a little better identified and make sure that there's the assurity that's not going to be too big of an impact on my personal life or my career. Got 2 kids in college, I kind of need to work right now. So I don't think I would want to test that. So maybe I think it would work if, as it did in Montana, as a starting point, if that were somehow more upheld at a legal level without a statute, but not at this time for me personally anyway.
And we, Diane, Wright, North Carolina, we agree with Dr. Weiss. We believe that legislation is absolutely necessary to make it absolutely clear to everybody, to give immunity. Also, in Montana, there is criminal immunity maybe, but it's not clear that there's civil immunity. And there's always a potential that an estranged parent or estranged relative could sue a doctor that writes a prescription. So we believe that legislation is the way to go. And also, the additional advantage of legislation is that there are always reporting requirements so that you can collect the data and learn from the data. Diane, we have a comment. We had a comment from Joan Keston that she really appreciated the way you put it, that the person is not a decision to end the life. They are already dying and they're just coming to grips with it. There is a question, I don't know to whom it's addressed. How does the Right to Die movement view Jack Kevorkian's legacy? Diane, do you have a comment on Jack Kevorkian? A fellow Armenian, I should add, a fellow Armenian?
No, I'm not Armenian. You are Armenian. I am Syrian.
Okay.
My parents were born in the Ottoman Empire of Turkey. I do believe that Jack Kevorkian started the conversation. He did do what many doctors have done for decades. That is, they have helped their patients die under the table by offering more morphine, by offering more quiet ways to die. And it has been talked about among physicians, not publicly, but we know that he started the public conversation. I don't like the way he went about doing it. I believe he felt strongly, however, about the right to choose to die. And I think that the strength of his feeling and his willingness to fly in the face of the law did, in fact, get the conversation started. It took a long time for Oregon to begin its work and finally to adopt its law on which all the other laws are based. I'm sad that he had to spend 8 years in prison, because I do believe that despite the fact that he carried out his deaths of mercy in the way he did, his heart was in the right place. So I say again, he started the conversation.
Thank you, Diane. Let me add also that Jack Kevorkian, first of all, there's a wonderful movie about him, You Don't Know Jack, starring Al Pacino. But Dr. Kevorkian was prosecuted several times in Michigan for aiding the suicide, so to speak. And he was acquitted each time because all he had done was provided either the drug to an individual who wanted to take it or hooked up somebody to a tube that that person could activate. What he was actually thrown in jail for was something else, euthanasia. where he, on TV, actually on 60 Minutes,
Yes.
directed the flow of morphine into someone's veins and watched them die. I'd like to point out that euthanasia, it remains illegal everywhere in this country, and even the 10 states where medical aid in dying is permitted.
Not
Euthanasia is
in Canada.
not in Canada. No, I was going to make the point. In Canada, it's perfectly legal. In Belgium and Netherlands and in New Zealand, it is perfectly legal. In the United States, there is no effort, there's no intention to expand it to euthanasia, even though in Canada, it's the preferred way for patients. Patients ask their doctors to apply the medicine, but we're not going there in this country. For Deric, there is a question. Is morphine the only medication used in medical aid in dying?
The answer is no. There's various different cocktails that can be prescribed based on availability and cost. The most recent one is a combination of 4 different medications, of which morphine is just one of them. And it seems to be readily available, and it's fairly cost effective. Around, last time I checked in Montana anyway, it was $300 to $500. Yeah, there are lots of different recipes, I guess, if you will, for different med regimens.
We have another question for Deric, but just I want to point out one thing on the medication. It used to be that in the country, 3 types of barbiturates were used: secobarbital, pentobarbital, and phenobarbital. First of all, the availability of these drugs became very difficult because one of the manufacturers, I believe, was unwilling to send it to the United States because sometimes that was a drug used for capital punishment. Then also another company bought the patent to one of these, the 3 barbiturates, and raised the price to something exorbitant like $10,000, something outrageous. And it became out of reach for a lot of people. So what Dr. Weiss is talking about, there is this morphine compound that's reasonably priced at $300 to $500, and is, I think, the one that's being increasingly used by physicians in the 10 states where it's available. Deric, there is a question, I don't know if you can see it, from Joan Keston. I think in tandem with this issue is the issue about advising folks about medications and treatments that they might not follow or take well in advance of death in order to not prolong their lives. Do you see this as something that doctors might consider doing, or is this against your ethical considerations?
No, it's absolutely not against ethical considerations, and that's mostly what I do as a palliative care physician, is go through medications carefully, what's no longer beneficial or helping you meet some goal, and we get rid of those things. If there's a medication, well, I'll just tell you a story. So I had a fairly young guy who was diagnosed with a bad type of dementia called Lewy body dementia, and he also happened to have heart disease. And we talked about it a lot. He said, I would rather die from a heart attack than go on living with progressive dementia for the next 5 or 10 years. And said, yeah, I could see that. I mean, most of us probably wouldn't mind just suddenly dropping dead from the widowmaker rather than faced with dementia. And so after a lot of conversation, we ended up stopping all of his cardiac medications and came to the understanding that if he was to have a cardiac arrest or a cardiac event, that would be his time and the end of his life, and we wouldn't intervene on that. So, I think those conversations are just routine for us in palliative care and should be with all of your primary doctors.
May I add to that, Ed, that for the documentary, When My Time Comes, I have recorded precisely that conversation with my grandson, telling him, and by virtue of telling him, telling my entire family that should I begin to exhibit signs of Alzheimer's. I do not want to continue living down that path. I have seen too many people in that situation who have really lost everything, and I don't want to do that, and have let my family know that should dementia take me on, I will not continue to live.
Thank you. Thank you. This is the big elephant in the room that I think all of us will face, is what happens if we do get dementia. I would like to add very quickly that we're also looking with Pricey Harrison to try to legitimize an advanced directive called a supplemental advanced directive for dementia that would make clear that if there was ever a diagnosis of dementia, that VSED would be instituted, the voluntary stopping of eating and drinking would be instituted, and that any effort to feed the person or to provide hydration would be refused, even if the person appears to want food or hydration at that point, because it's a natural human reflex if you give a spoon full of applesauce to accept it. But hopefully this advanced directive would be enforceable, and we may have to get either a test case or legislation to make it enforceable. I think we have time for one more question, because I did promise that we would end at 5:30, and we're actually going a little bit over. The question is, can someone on the panel address if there is progress in educating MDs, medical doctors, about medical aided dying? And if yes, how is it being addressed, and what type of responses have been heard in medical school training, in medical schools? So if anyone knows the answer to that, Deric, do you know if there's better education at the younger level for the interns and students?
I don't specifically about medical aid in dying, but I will say that palliative care has become a routine part of medical education now. So, I mean, that's the first step, because we didn't even have that. We didn't even train doctors how to have these conversations. This is all stuff I've learned by doing. But now in medical training, that's part of the curriculum to learn just basic palliative care and how to have these conversations. So how to respond to somebody that asks for medical aid in dying.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's...
And I'll be glad to take that on, because I actually sat in on a lecture given by Dr. Grube, who is the medical director for Compassion and Choices. He gave a lecture to third-year medical students at George Washington University on this very subject, medical aid in dying. Our hope is in the future of those young doctors. The older doctors who were trained decades ago, many of them set in their ways. The newer, younger ones have begun understanding and hearing lectures like the one Dr. Grube gave, asking questions, participating, and understanding that do no harm means it's the patient who decides what suffering is. It's the patient who decides how much longer one wants to go on, not the doctor. Doctors used to be gods, but they are no longer. We, the patients, have taken more control of our lives, and that's the good part.
There was a second part of that question on what type of responses have been heard from the doctors on this. And I did give a grand rounds talk to our medical staff about medical aid in dying, and it opened up some good discussion. But boy, a few of the guys were ready to burn me at the stake. And one of the most vocal critics, and his basis for it was because of his religious upbringing. But he was a strong critic, outspoken critic of my own. And then an interesting thing happened, like a couple of months later, he needed a new doctor, and all of a sudden he came to see me as a patient. So I don't know if he got over that or changed his mind, but I think doctors are like everybody else. We have our ethics and morals are based on a lot of our upbringing, which revolves around, religious morality.
So I'd like to beg the indulgence of everyone for one final question. I know we're over, but it's an interesting question, and I guess it's addressed to all our four panelists. First of all, do you have any thoughts about final exit and the use of nitrogen asphyxia at the end of life, which is Final Exit is one of the national networks that works on end-of-life issues. And then also, do you have any comment on the impact of the Death Cafe movement? And we have Nidra Clark, who is a Death Cafe hostess in Hillsborough, North Carolina. Any comment about how the Death Cafe movement might interact with the medical aid in dying? So this would be for any one of the four panelists.
Death cafes are working beautifully. There are neighborhoods that come together. There are church groups that come together. I spoke before one in Massachusetts. They are so enthusiastic about being able to share with their friends and neighbors and even with strangers what it is they want and don't want at the end of life. As I said earlier, it's not one conversation, it's many conversations. And to begin that first conversation unlocks so many doors. As for how one goes about taking one's life into one's own hands in a state that does not allow medical aid in dying, there's a lot of literature out there, and Final Exit does have all of that written down very, very carefully in that book, which I have on my bedside and will continue to refer to it the older I get.
Thank you. Well, Diane, you don't look like you're aging, so I wouldn't worry about that. I'm going to have to end with this, Price, because it is actually a topical question. Pricey, this is to you. What are the legislative chances this year? What is the best way to get legislation rolling in 2021?
And by the way, I really appreciate your putting this together, Ed, and others who participated on it. It's been really helpful to hear this discussion. There's very little chance we'll get substantive legislation this cycle, because we just have this habit of studying issues and understanding the implications and then enacting legislation. And so this issue has just not had any attention yet. And we really would consider it a victory if we could get a study. And I hope our oversight committee or a separately composed committee, and Ed, you and I have been working really hard with the leadership to try and get that done. One thing that, and I hate that this is perceived as a partisan issue, because others have said this is not a partisan issue. And we've got bipartisan support on the legislation, which is great. And we'll have bipartisan support this upcoming election cycle, although this legislative cycle, although we lost one of our Republican champions who retired, Chuck McGrady. So I think I will consider a victory if we can get a study. What we need to do to even get there is to make sure that folks who are interested in this issue let their legislators know, because we'll have to overcome the resistance of groups that are sort of traditional opponents of this issue, and our very own sort of the Christian Action League and a few others of those conservative groups that have already given major pushback. But I'm hopeful there's broad support for this. I don't understand the resistance, but I don't want to analogize it, but like we still don't have medical marijuana enacted in this state. We've been working for 15 years and there are 37 states that have it. And it just, some of these things that make nothing but sense are not making it past our legislature. But we'll continue to fight for it. And we've got good champions in Dying Right NC. Compassionate Choices has gotten involved some. I'm not familiar with those other organizations because I'm not sure they've gotten active at the legislative level yet, but it's we need all the allies we can get, and we need all the non-traditional allies we can get that might appeal to a broader spectrum of legislators who might have dug-in opinions on this that could use some enlightenment.
Thank you, Pricey. So I'd like to first of all thank all of you who joined. I especially want to thank our four esteemed speakers, Representative Harrison, Diane Rehm, Barbara Mancini, and Dr. Deric Weiss. If you want to know how you can help, I think as Pricey just pointed out, it will be really writing to legislators, telling them that you support this mission, this effort, this cause. And once we get a bill introduced, then it's easier to tell your legislator to support a certain bill. So I believe if you haven't written to us, please do write to us and just tell us of your interest in being involved. And as soon as we have a bill introduced, we'll send you the bill and you can write to your legislator. That will be the single most helpful thing, both in the House and in the Senate. I would point out one other thing. We really need to convince Republicans because they control both of the chambers. And so if you have friends that live in red districts and you can talk to them to write to their legislator, that will be extremely helpful. So I want to thank again everyone for joining. This is a process. We are absolutely dedicated to making it a reality in North Carolina. And I think with your help, it will come to pass. Maybe not sooner than later, but it will come to pass. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Pricey. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Deric. Have a good evening, everybody.